I'll now introduce John Ashbery, for those who need any introduction to him, really. Born in 1927, Ashbery is among the protagonists of the so-called New York School of Poetry, a group of poets coalescing during the 50s and 60s and indebted to such poets as Wallace Stevens, Auden, William Carlos Williams, among others before them. In some ways, Ashbery's engagement with art and his place here is a literal one. He was art editor of the European edition of the New York Herald Tribune until 1965, writing on artists from Henri Michaud to Andy Warhol. And once he moved back to America, he was editor of Art News until 1972, a publication notable for its deep ties to abstract expressionism and its legacies. He has a book that will be coming out next month, both here in the United States. He introduces that. And after that, I had a short exchange with him. Those who know Ashbery know him to be, like his poetry, intellectual, generous, and playful. By the way, but he's also perhaps a little reticent when it comes to discussing his practice, both in terms of its structuring and potential relationships to other disciplines. So my meeting took place with him on Saturday, and it didn't prove an exception. One feels a bit the fool for asking for defined answers from someone who has said, quote, he wishes to produce a poem that the critic cannot even talk about. Still, I think one sees a number of parallel histories here, and one finds that his answers to the questions very much resemble his poems. Thank you. John Ashbery.
I'll read a few poems from my forthcoming book, being published next month in England by Carcanet and in America as well. The first one I'll read is called Alcove. Is it possible that spring could be once more approaching? We forget each time what a mindless business it is, porous like sleep, adrift on the horizon, refusing to take sides, mugwump of the final hour, lest an agenda horrors be imputed to it, and the whole point of its being spring collapse like a hole dug in sand. It's breathy, though, you have to say that for it. And should further seasons coagulate into years like spilled, dried paint, why, who's to say we weren't provident? We indeed looked out for others as though they mattered, and they, catching the spirit, came home with us, spent the night in an alcove from which their breathing could be heard clearly. But it's not over yet. Terrible incidents happen daily. That's how we get around obstacles. The plywood years. Here in the open, love lies apart, singing to its beads. How reflective is that? Don't be such a goose, love said. They'll tinsel you. They came after me, and in the end I was a sot. They said on TV it didn't matter. One fallen ice cube is left. The others go in. So it was on your conscience the hangover happened? You don't want to call. Others than you are surfeited. Bobby Burns said a rose is like no other. Neither is a lintel a blood-red reef. They came and sat on the pier next to me. I had piqued their curiosity, just like in the old days. One spoke to a kitten. They shrugged. I hadn't had the mirror experience in the hangar yet. Those were all days tumbling over me like water, like a scented caress. Then a bumblebee gladdens earth with its silver sound. We lived under tar paper and ebony slats, dragging one's feet across the floor. Oh, if you're going to then do it, advised the egg beater. Time got left out of the equation. This one is a collage made up of movie titles, sort of a found object that I lifted from the index of Leonard Maltin's Guide to Movies on TV. Not quite, but almost. They knew what they wanted. They all kissed the bride. They all laughed. They came from beyond space. They came by night. They came to a city. They came to blow up America. They came to rob Las Vegas. They dare not love. They died with their boots on. They shoot horses, don't they? They go boom. They got me covered. They flew alone. They gave him a gun. They just had to get married. They live. They loved life. They lived by night. They drive by night. They knew Mr. Knight. They were expendable. They met in Argentina. They met in Bombay. They met in the dark. They might be giants. They made me a fugitive. They made me a criminal. They only kill their masters. They shall have music. They were sisters. They still call me Bruce. They won't believe me. They won't forget. Here's another movie-related film. Poem. The Tower of London isn't really a tower. It's a square building with towers at each of the four corners. In the 30s, they made a movie of it starring Boris Karloff as Mord, the executioner who dabbled in torture. A busy man was Mord. His boss, Richard III, was demanding. Richard had no hump on his back, but Boris had a club foot as though to make up for it. Richard drowned the Duke of Clarence, whose name wasn't Clarence, in a tub of Malmsey, a sweet-tasting wine. Clarence had stood in his way. Richard was determined to kill all who stood in his way, including the princes in the tower, two little boys, practically infants, the sons of old Henry VI, or maybe of Richard's half-brother Edward, played by Ian Hunter. Richard was played by Basil Rathbone, who also played Sherlock Holmes. The princes, also named Richard and Edward, I believe, hadn't done anything. They didn't deserve to be killed. But then none of them did, including old Henry VI, although he was quite dotty at the time. Richard's bride was unlike the Queen in the play Richard III. She was played by Barbara O'Neill, who played Scarlett O'Hara's mother in Gone with the Wind, though she wasn't old enough to be. That's the way I remember it. Wait, she was actually Edward's wife. Richard took unto him the Lady Anne, who was played by Nan Gray, though she actually married Wyatt, John Sutton, after they escaped from the tower or the castle. In the end, Richard killed just about everybody except Mord, who got thrown off a cliff by somebody, a fitting end to a miserable career.
At one point, you referred to one of your poems as a film in a sort of wonderful Freudian slip. But
yeah.
How do you think of your poetry in relationship to film?
Well, it's sort of hard to say, isn't it? Well, they unspool the way films do in my head, and they're a sort of linear experience. Is what I call them, like listening to music, which I do a lot too, including when I'm writing. And in other words, you can't sort of sit and take it all in at once, like you can, say, a picture. You have to be prepared to be moved from the beginning to the end.
You've said on a number of occasions that being in the audience for John Cage's Music of Changes in 1952 altered your sense of poetry and its composition. Yeah, the quote is, "I suddenly saw potential for writing in a new way." And could you elaborate on that? How, like, in what way did it change?
Well, again, that's very difficult to put into words, and in fact, it's impossible to say in what way music can influence one's poetry, for instance. How does this happen? I don't know. But the music sort of, I'd never heard anything like it before, although I'd heard Cage's sonatas and interludes for prepared piano, which is sort of rather dreamlike, mostly very quiet pieces. This was a work composed according to throwing coins and then finding the appropriate passage in the I Ching. I don't know exactly how he did it, but it was, there would be periods of silence followed by really brutal crashes, and then maybe a single note somewhere on the keyboard, and then silence again. And it wasn't obviously wasn't written according to sonata form or anything else known to music then. It was just sort of digging into the moment and coming up with these wonderful sounds which coalesced into a kind of music that was completely new to me and new, period. So it was sort of a mysterious experience. I had been in a very dry period for about 1.5 years, unable to write anything that I liked very much, and right after that I started writing again, and although it didn't happen immediately, I started liking what I wrote, and I feel it was generated by the experience of that concert, but I can't say too specifically how it happened.
There was a phrase that you used earlier, getting away from music as we know it, and you've used that before about poetry, as well.
Yeah.
In which case I'll ask, how does one get away from poetry as we know it?
Well, one wants to kind of keep one's toe still somehow attached to the girder of poetry that's 70 stories up in the air. I believe that one must retain a relation to traditional, or not traditional, but art as we know it, but at the same time get as far from it as possible without breaking the bond, the link.